Pop quiz for real. If I asked you, what is the biggest church state separation problem facing the country right now, what do you think it would be? I think there are some people who might say it's the crazy things said by Mike Johnson or Lauren Boebert in the name of Jesus, like crazy Republicans saying crazy things. Maybe you say it's attempts to shove the Ten Commandments into courthouses or get Christian chaplains into public schools. I think the answer is actually way more under the radar. It's not as overtly Christian nationalistic as that, and that's partly why it's such a big problem. My response to that question would be vouchers. It's the fact that a number of states are taking money that should be going to public schools and they're shifting them away from public schools and into private schools. And private schools are almost always religious schools, and religious schools are almost always Christian schools. Basically, a lot of states are using taxpayer dollars to fund religious indoctrination. And the Washington Post this week ran a really big article talking about this problem. It was written by their reporters Laura Meckler and Michelle Borstein. And basically, let me show you some of these statistics that they pointed out here. Billions in taxpayer dollars are being used to pay tuition at religious schools throughout the country as state voucher programs expand dramatically and the line separating public education and religion fades. Look at some of these numbers here. I know I'm skipping through the article, but like some of these states are offering up to $16,000 per student per year. And that stuff adds up. In just 5 states with these programs, more than 700,000 students benefited from vouchers this school year. The program, popular with conservatives, are rapidly growing in GOP-run states, with a total of 29 states plus DC operating some sort of voucher system. Look at this map, too. I'll leave this up for a bit. These are states that have voucher programs. I'll remove myself so you can see it. But you can see, like, there are a lot of states, and they're not all just red states, that have universal or near universal vouchers. A bunch of the lighter blue states here that are smaller voucher programs, and some states, I'm surprised to see Texas on there, frankly, right now anyway, that don't have voucher programs at all. But again, all of these states are saying, oh, you parents, you want to send your kid to a private religious school? Let us help you do it by stealing money that should be going to public schools. And they do this in the name of school choice. That's the buzzword. But like, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which is a nonprofit group that talks about this stuff, they say, let me show you this, at least 1 in 3 states are considering or have enacted school voucher expansions alongside broad untargeted property tax cuts. And research suggests property tax cuts result in disproportionately less funding for districts serving large numbers of students of color. And just to summarize what they're saying here, in places where they're taking money out of public schools and siphoning them and giving them to private schools, that hurts communities that are not very wealthy. That hurts communities that have large populations of people of color. And that's a big problem with all of this. It makes the public schools in those communities worse. And those schools were already underfunded and under-resourced to begin with. And if you hurt the public schools, what does that do down the line? It hurts the very communities where they are located. That's what vouchers are doing. Back to that Washington Post article for a second. Look at what they did in Ohio this past year, where they made it, where they did a lot with vouchers. Here we go. More than 150,000 students are paying tuition with vouchers this year. When vouchers for students with autism and other disabilities who typically seek specific services are removed from the list, the portion going toward religious education rose to 98%. Virtually all of the money, taxpayer dollars, that could be used for vouchers were going towards religious education when you took out disabilities and students using it for that reason. That's insane. I There was one part of this. I'm gonna scroll down for a second here. Oops, I lie. I'll come back to that in a second. But I think elsewhere in the article, it said that at some schools, as many as 80% of the students who attend these private religious schools were attending because of vouchers. There was a Catholic school in Cincinnati that has like 1,300 students, 1,100 of them got taxpayer funded vouchers. In Arizona, this is another thing this Washington Post article noted. They've also been big on vouchers. Last year, three-quarters of the money, about almost $250 million, went to 184 vendors. Most of that money went for tuition, 87% of it to religious schools. And it gets worse in Arizona, especially. Check this out. In Arizona, the cost of universal vouchers has exceeded the $624 million budgeted for the year, contributing to a budget hole that lawmakers have no clue how to fill. That budget crunch could affect public school spending and certainly makes any increases unlikely at a time when public schools are struggling. Arizona schools are not able to pay for teacher pay raises or desperately needed resources. You just have teachers begging for copy paper and markers. It's so bad. This is robbing our local public schools and our most vulnerable students. And this is the problem when you underfund public schools. Teachers who are qualified don't want to teach at them because they don't have the resources they need. The money that could be used to improve those schools is gone. And here's the other thing, all of this, again, is done in the name of school choice, that parents have the right to choose the best education for their children. And if that happens to be a religious school, so be it. The problem is that a lot of the students getting this money, they were already attending private schools. Their parents were already paying private school tuition. But now that the state's offering voucher money, those same already well off parents are like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll take some of that voucher money and I'll keep sending my kid to this private school that we were already going to pay for. Why not? Like, the rich just get richer. And in addition to that, the public schools then miss out. That's especially concerning because public schools are for everyone by definition, while private schools could reject students with special needs, students who have same sex parents, students who may need additional help because they have some disability, etc. So this is why, and in Arizona, by the way, Republicans have a slim majority in the House and the Senate, and yet they're able to do all of this stuff that hurts the entire state. In states where Republicans control the legislature, this is becoming a financial problem as well as an ethical one for all the reasons I just mentioned. Now, you could make an argument that vouchers are allowing some parents to send their kids to an overwhelmingly white private school instead of a more integrated public school. And if you don't believe me about that, where do you think the idea of school choice even came from? Like, the whole history of school choice was when Brown v. Board of Education was decided in the 1950s. A lot of parents were like, I don't want to send my kid to a school with African American children. Let me just send them to a private religious school so they don't have to deal with that. That's the origins of school choice. And it's exactly what the outcome is going to be as more people use vouchers too. So, why is all of this happening? Why are vouchers getting so popular now of all times? Part of the reason, you can blame the Supreme Court for this. In 2020, the right-wing Supreme Court ruled on a case, it was called Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue. And basically what they said is that taxpayer funding could subsidize private religious education. If states like Montana offered funding for private schools at all, they may also have to extend that funding to private religious schools. It depended on the kind of funding we were talking about. But it really hit the fan a couple years later in a case involving the state of Maine. And I have talked about this before, but here's the story behind what happened in Maine and why all of this really exploded. In Maine, students are guaranteed, like by the state constitution, they are guaranteed a free public education until they graduate high school, which sounds right and decent and great. But in some rural parts of Maine, and there are a lot of those, there are no local public schools. So students have the option of attending a private school on the state's dime, assuming they were accepted into those schools. State law, however, mandated that those schools have to be secular because you can't have taxpayer money paying tuition at a religious school, obviously. Well, right wing groups then sued the state of Maine, saying, "You're discriminating against us as Christians." And the Supreme Court in 2022 said, "Yeah, they are." So John Roberts said Maine's breaking the law by not allowing taxpayer dollars to go to private religious schools. If you give money to private schools for any reason, you got to be able to give it to religious schools as well. So that's kind of what's happening with vouchers now, because all these states have green lights to say, oh, we were trying to help students who may have to go to a private school for whatever reason. And that just opened the floodgates to parents who can afford it saying, well, I want to send my kid to a private school that's religious and teaches creationism. And now they're getting tax dollars to do it because their states are saying, yeah, we'll give you the money to do it. And it hurts public education and it hurts those students and it ruins the state, because if you don't have a good public education system, you're not helping out your state either. So what used to be a straightforward application of church state separation has basically been twisted into an argument of religious discrimination, which this wasn't. Like, I think I saw one commenter put it this way: forget separation of church and state. This is saturation of church and state. And the conservative Christians and Catholics who constantly complain about being persecuted, they now have the most powerful people in the country giving them legal justification to take money from public schools to enrich themselves and misinform students. And at the same time, they are hurting the most vulnerable people in the state. So taxpayers in half the country now are funding creationism, homophobia, anti-trans misinformation. It's all Sunday school masquerading as actual history and science. And by the way, I know we talked about Oklahoma for the last story. Oklahoma just went a step further, thanks to Ryan Walters. They just decided to open a publicly funded charter school that happens to be Catholic. They don't even count that as a private school. They're calling that a public school and giving it money to operate. And there is a lawsuit over that, and we'll see how that goes. But that is happening right now. And the moral of the story is taxpayer dollars should never be used to prop up religion. But instead of giving that money to churches, conservatives found a way to give it to religious schools while destroying legal precedent along the way. None of this makes life better for public school students because these laws are not meant for them. Vouchers are nothing more than gifts for rich people who don't need the financial help. And religious schools, it's a gift for religious schools that would not be popular enough to exist on their own. And this all has a ripple effect throughout those communities. And by the way, you know what's going to happen. Public schools are going to get worse in these states. And then conservatives are going to be like, well, we can't support public schools because they suck in our state. Let's give more money to the private religious schools. Like, you could see that slippery slope happening in real time. And the people who live in these religious bubbles just don't care about life outside their bubble. They are so willing to let others suffer in the long term as long as they can benefit in the short term. All right, I will take some questions here. That was an annoying story, wasn't it? In Arizona, vouchers started as a way for parents to place students with educational disabilities, most often autism, in private special ed schools. Yes, it was. And now it's run rampant. Yep. And now it's like, forget those kids. Let's just help Christians go to Christian schools. Why put them in the same space as heathens? Did you see Scalia's opinion where he made note of wanting to overturn gay marriage? He straight up said that non-Christian rulings make Christians appear to be bigots and get discriminated against as such. Yeah, was that the no, it wasn't the Obergefell ruling. Yeah, Alito in the Dobbs case, or maybe it was Clarence Thomas in the Dobbs case, or something like that. But yeah, like, yeah, your beliefs make you look bad. That's how your beliefs work. If you don't want to be labeled as a bigot, you know what you can do? Stop being one. That never occurs to these people. They're so unpopular and they don't get why they're unpopular because, like, they're just following the Bible. It's It's like, yep, nope, that's not immunity from being a jerk. How do charter schools fit into the picture? Those are public schools and not private schools. So they're like independently operated public schools that have the blessing of the state, so to speak. But I would argue charter schools in a lot of cases also hurt public school students because charter schools can set their own standards for who they accept, and they don't necessarily have to take students with disabilities or educational disorders or students who are remedial or need remedial education. So, I mean, look, I taught at a public school for a number of years. I went to public schools my entire childhood and through college. So, like, maybe I'm biased, but also the data bears this out. Uh, I understand that not all public schools are great, but that's all the more reason we ought to be funding them better and raising teacher pay to bring in people who are really good at those jobs, because there's so often teacher shortages because that profession doesn't pay that much. So charter schools are not as bad as like private schools, but it depends on which ones you're talking about. They're hit or miss, and that's also true of public schools. Also, collapsing society is the biggest threat, and there are some people who just want to watch the world burn, and then they'll blame it on everyone but themselves, right?